Okay guys, chapter 13. This is kind of a long, boring chapter, so a lot of this stuff we've talked about before in other chapters, so I'm going to do my best to make it not super boring and get through it fairly quickly. Okay, so... Oof, that's a lot of objectives. Yeah, there's really nothing important to read here. Origins of the juvenile court. I think we all know that the juvenile and adult systems used to be one. Juveniles were not always treated differently than adults. They used to be treated just like adults, and it wasn't until 1899 when the United States finally decided, hey, maybe kids should be treated differently than adults in court. Parens patriae. I know we've talked about this. The court is your daddy. You all know what that means. The child savers. This is a group of people who, in the late 1800s, believed that the juveniles should be treated differently than adults. And again, I'm going through this quickly because we have done this. We've talked about this before. We talked about my dude, John Augustus, who is the father of probation. The same type of concept is how probation started with juveniles. You all know what probation is, I think. You are being allowed to live with your parents under certain terms and conditions. If you do not comply with those, you are probably going to get locked up and removed from your parent. Okay, so go ahead and read that. Residential treatment programs, we've talked about this as well. These are typically group homes, and this is where some young people are placed, maybe because their parents cannot adequately care for them, whatever the need is. So some of those are going to be delinquents as well, which we've talked about. House of Refuge was kind of a place where, almost like an orphanage, where young people would live. So it was, if you think of an orphanage when you think of that. I'm kind of skipping through this stuff because I think that we've already talked about this. We've talked about diversion programs as well. Diversion programs are things like drug court, like restorative justice, where you comply with this program, you do what you're supposed to do, and your case gets dismissed and sealed as if it never happened. If you don't comply, then you go through the court system. Youth court versus drug court. Some of you are familiar with youth court, which is something that is on all of the high school campuses in Fresno Unified, Clovis Unified, Sanger Unified. And this is when a judge actually comes out to the school and an informal court proceeding takes place. And it's very similar to drug court. They're diversion programs. And again, I'm not going to go into this, as I think we have lectured about this for hours already at other times. These are other types of diversion programs that we've talked about before. Diversion programs, diversion programs, diversion programs. Now, typically, they're going to handle first-time nonviolent offenders. Skipping through. Juvenile drug court movement. Drug courts are very similar to a youth court, where a young person is arrested for whatever crime, and if they comply with this program with the courts, meaning go to drug treatment, test, and not get arrested again, and if they comply with all of that, then their case gets dismissed and sealed like it never happened. Recidivism. Recidivism is an important concept, and again, I think that we have talked about this before, but this is typically a person who has been through a correctional program of some sort and has reoffended. So that's what recidivism is. And this is really a way to address whether or not, or determine whether or not probation is effective. If people reoffend and they are recidivists, then the probation or whatever the program was not effective. Diversion versus non-diversion. So we're going to kind of just whip through this. we've talked about all of this stuff before, so that's really good. I thought this was going to be a really long chapter, but juvenile courts are responsible for disposing of cases referred to them. These are some other types of sentences that youthful offenders might get. They might get probation. They might have to go to a day reporting center, which is a center where they go to school half the day, then they go to treatment the other half of the day, and then they go home at night. So they go there Monday through Friday, 8 hours a day, treatment half the day, education the other half the day, and then they go home for the weekends. Or they could be committed to long-term institutions. This is the process. Someone complains, a person gets taken into custody, they get referred to juvenile court, the intake officer looks at it, decides whether or not to send the case to the DA. If they decide to send it to the DA, then it goes to court hearings, adjudication, disposition, and placement. Police officers use a lot of discretion when dealing with adults and juveniles. So these are some similarities with juvenile and adults. Miranda warnings are valid in both juvenile and adult proceedings. They can be detained pre-trial, plea bargaining is used, sentence options are similar, and supervision post-release can be used. Juveniles, I don't like this because in California this is not true. Juveniles cannot be arrested for status offenses in California. Age determines the jurisdiction of the juvenile court. Parents are deeply involved in the juvenile system, and in the adult system, not at all. Juvenile courts cannot sentence to jail or prison, and juvenile court is more informal. Basic correctional model. Rehabilitation, rehabilitation, and rehabilitation. Rehabilitation is the concept of the correctional model in the juvenile system throughout the United States. Justice model. This is not typically what is used in the juvenile worlds, but the justice model is kind of like just desserts. You committed the crime, now do the time. That's kind of the concept of what this justice model. Crime control model. Commit a crime, get locked up. That's their concept, but neither one of these is really strongly used in the juvenile world. Balanced and restorative model. Yay, that's what we're looking for, trying to restore people. Therapeutic methods that are used in juvenile facilities, all different types of therapy. Take the time to read those. Group counseling programs. Group guided interaction. Positive peer culture. You'll see this, well, you won't see this because we aren't going to juvenile hall, but they do use this positive peer culture in juvenile hall. These are some other purposes or hopeful end results for these treatment models. Reducing relapse, reducing criminality, reducing inmate misconduct. You can read all this as opposed to, graduated sanctions. Graduated sanctions. As you can guess, if you commit your first crime and it is not very serious, the punishment is probably not going to be very significant. As you continue to commit more crimes and they become more serious, your punishment would get more significant as well. Minority overrepresentation is a significant issue, certainly in California in the juvenile justice system. Minority youth are definitely overrepresented in the juvenile justice system, and it's been quite some time that the state of California has been working on trying to address that issue and figure out, number one, why it's an issue, and number two, how it can be fixed. Minorities are overrepresented among youths held in secure detention, petitioned to court, and adjudicated delinquent. DMC, disproportionate minority confinement. This is, again, just before I left probation, we had a meeting, and it was with a college, and I can't remember which university it was, based out of the Bay Area, and they'd come to Fresno County because they wanted to address with us the fact that we had so many minority youth in custody in our facility. And it was really interesting to try and figure out ways to reduce that. And most of the things that we did to try and reduce that was get involved with the communities, like community resources. We would go out to the churches and the neighborhoods and things like that and try and build relationships with them so that they could build better relationships with the youth in their neighborhoods. This is an ongoing problem. Possible trends: expansion of restorative justice. Restorative justice, like we talked about, is a diversion program. This is the one where the victim and the offender work together to try and make the community whole. There's going to be a lot more of this because, again, we don't have the bed space. So that's definitely one way. Increased use of technology, things like GPS devices, maybe even online counseling. I'm guessing right now, I'm recording this during the coronavirus quarantine. So those of you who are in the class right now are like, yeah, we know that, Fernandez. But I might use this recording for another class in the future. So we're all trying to figure out how to use technology to get the point across and to interact and things like that. So that's definitely another thing that will be used in the future. Greater use of evidence-based practices. And this is something that we talked about in class as well. It will no longer be the gut feeling of the probation officer. It will be what the data tells us is the most effective thing to do. Legislatures are likely to become more rather than less involved in juvenile court. That is definitely happening. The issue of gun control is revisited every time there's a mass shooting, so this is going to continue. It's likely that the juvenile justice system will continue in its present form. And I agree with that wholeheartedly too. Everybody wants to rehabilitate youth, and I think that whole concept is going to remain the same for decades. That's it. It was kind of boring. Sorry, guys. I tried.